Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Kathryn Sikkink, an international relations scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School, best known for her work on human rights, international norms, transnational advocacy networks, and transnational justice. Her recent books include The Justice Cascade: How Human Rights Prosecutions Are Changing World Politics, Evidence for Hope, The Hidden Face of Rights Towards a Politics of Responsibility, and co-authored with Richard Price, International Norms, Moral Psychology and Neuroscience. I welcome Kathryn Sikkink to Savage Minds. I'm very fascinated by your career. You are a leading figure in this theoretical strain of international relations called constructivism, which emphasizes how ideas, beliefs, and norms, rather than simply or only material power, shape international politics. And I'm also fascinated by your work on human rights policy. Now, there's a lot of human rights issues afloat at this very moment. So I would like to maybe start off with your book, Evidence for Hope, that challenges the narrative that human rights are failing. Many people might think this when they see what's happening in Gaza, or even when we step back to Madeleine Albright's infamous, "I think it was worth it," referring to the 50,000 Iraqi infants who died as a result of our sanctions. How do you respond to critics who argue that international human rights law is too idealistic or unenforceable?
Let me just start by saying that international human rights law, of course, is idealistic. Um, and I think many people actually take international human rights law for granted, as if it was always there, we always knew it. And so one of the first things I do in my classes is I say, human rights are a social construction. What do I mean by that? I don't mean that human rights violations are a social construction. Torture is all too real, right? It leaves physical and psychological marks on the body for a lifetime and sometimes into multiple generations. But the idea that you have a right to be free from torture is a social construction, right? It's a relatively as international law, this is relatively recent. Okay, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. We have, as I have written, prior to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man, la Declaración Americana de Derechos y Deberes del Hombre, which was drafted by Latin American countries in 1948, actually 8 months before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But even so, the idea of human rights as not as internationally protected and recognized human rights has existed only since the 1948. And those two declarations were not treaties. They were not legally enforceable. It was not until 1976 that the two first international treaties that covered human rights finally went into effect, went into force. Those were the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So some people take human rights for granted, and don't recognize that they were created through struggle of people all over the world to try to define what our human rights were and to put them into declarations and then law. Though human rights law has continued to expand to incorporate new rights, so we now have much more detailed conventions on women's rights, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We have conventions on the rights of people with disabilities, for example, which is the most recent of the major human rights conventions. So that was one big step, right, to just articulate our rights and put them into law. Everything else depends on that. Then comes the big question you raise, and that is, can they be enforced? And that's a really difficult question. It depends partly, and here you're going to get the political scientist in me, it depends partly on what do we mean by enforced, right? We don't mean that all of our rights are automatically somehow guaranteed and protected just because we have these treaties. The enforcement of human rights is yet another set of struggles that I can see from your description of your life that you've been involved and witness to these struggles. In other words, rights continue to every day in and out, we continue to struggle to protect our rights. And if we stop struggling, we will lose our rights. And that's one of the things that we are seeing today in America under the Trump administration, is that people in the United States may have taken their rights for granted, but we have learned that just like in every other part of the world, we too have to struggle to protect our rights. And we've seen that very recently in Minneapolis, for example. You may not know that I grew up in Minnesota, I went to school in Minneapolis, and I taught at the University of Minnesota for many years. So I've been watching here, I'm in Uruguay, I'm speaking from Uruguay, but I've been watching events in Minneapolis with pride. I mean, the events, the people are struggling and demanding and trying to protect their rights. I've been watching that with pride. And of course, I've been watching with horror the fact that ICE officials are killing individuals on the streets of Minneapolis.
My field work on the disappeared Muslim men was in fact around ICE, but I was doing this back in 2004 and 5 when ICE was disappearing 14,000 men from, there was that list of special registration, all Muslim countries plus North Korea. That was George W. Bush. Yay. So it's quite daunting that we have a Gestapo force in our own country. I am horrified by this, but at the same time, we've also seen in recent years the whitewashing of George W. Bush and his crimes, the human rights violations, the whole setup to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, these occupations. There's been no justice around that. When I say justice, I mean both for the people of these countries. I guess I should include Pakistan because we had drone warfare there as well. And for people in the States. Remember back when the protests started in the early noughts, you had kettling starting to be undertaken by the police of New York and other police forces. And then I'm thinking, you're sitting in Uruguay. Uruguay, like Chile, like Argentina, like many other countries, had a military dictatorship between 1973 and 1985, which also experienced the same type of torture and forced disappearances as we saw in Argentina. 30,000 disappeared, and in Chile, far less, but still great numbers have disappeared. Those countries managed to have investigations as to what went on. In our country, we do not have that. And we have not had that. And then we keep having these wars declared by sitting presidents, but not by Congress. So how is it that we might hope for some international justice when we can't even have domestic justice, as it were?
So you've just mentioned Uruguay and Argentina, and one of the things you may remember from the introduction to my book, The Justice Cascade, is that as a 20-year-old exchange student from the University of Minnesota, I lived in Montevideo, Uruguay for a year during the dictatorship in 1976. And so really my interest in human rights in Latin America goes back that many years to 1976. I later did my dissertation research in Argentina in 1985, the very year that the justice system there, after return to democracy, was holding the trials of the juntas. And I was able to, they permitted people to come in and observe those trials, and I was able to observe the trials. So my interest in justice goes way back. But I also want to say that the Argentine trials in 1985 were among the first in the world. In other words, virtually no country in the world had ever held their own former officials criminally accountable for human rights violations. when I wrote the book, The Justice Cascade, I went back and did some research, and it turns out that both Greece, after the coup that brought the colonel's junta to power, and Portugal were the first two countries who really did have domestic prosecutions to hold their former members of their former governments, authoritarian governments, accountable. Okay. Those cases are much less well known than the case of Argentina, which I think really caught the consciousness of the world. But I went, as I did interviews in Argentina, and you'll appreciate this as someone who does ethnography. I kept working with Argentine human rights activists. I'm saying, when did you first make the demand for justice? And they said, during our early demonstrations, as in the early 1980s, when we started to be able to finally get back in the streets, we were afraid to even put the word justice in our banners, in our demonstrations, because we realized that calling for justice was threatening the regime, and we could be punished for that. So I tried to point the point where people even started to imagine that justice was possible and put it in their demands. And that happened really in Argentina after the defeat of the military government in the Malvinas War. Okay, so when the government was weakened by that defeat, the Argentine human rights groups, with the support of the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, were finally able to demand justice. And then with a transition to democracy, and I think extraordinary enlightened leadership by the Alfonsín government after the transition, they were able to have one of the first important truth commissions in the world. They were able to have the trials of the juntas, and eventually also reparations policies and other transitional justice. So the story really of transitional justice in many ways starts first in Southern Europe, in Greece and Portugal, and then in Latin America and Argentina, as you said, later Chile, quite a bit later Chile, Uruguay, and other countries also took important steps for having accountability.
One thing that really impressed me when I was there was not only the fact that CONADEP, something that you would frankly never see in the States. I mean, they put Ernesto Sabato in charge of the commission, anyone who wants to read an Argentine writer, read him, brilliant writer. And he created a commission which included 13 prominent intellectuals, religious figures, the Rabbi Marshall Meyer, human rights activists, and he did this to ensure objectivity. Again, what was our Iran-Contra investigation like? I mean, it's almost like a Monty Python sketch, comparatively. I hate to say it. And the Nunca Más report became, in a way, the gold standard for many in the field of human rights and justice. It became a reference at the very least. They exposed 340 clandestine detention centers. Mm-hmm. I've been in some of them. I even went to Garage Olimpo, and it was interesting because it's still functioning as a garage now. I talked to the neighbors and they'd say, yeah, we heard screams, but we thought it was the radio. And then there was a lot of motors being tested and a lot of mechanic noise. So we couldn't quite tell. And I found it fascinating how right there in the middle of a popular barrio was a torture camp. All of them. I've been to ESMA. La ESMA is an escuela militar. Mm-hmm. And one of my subjects, one of the hijos, he was born there. So he made a joke to me one day and he said, when anyone asks me where I was born, I always say, oh, I was born on Avenida de la Libertad. In Buenos Aires, that's a very Fifth Avenue type of name. But he was born in a detention camp there at La ESMA. Fascinating. We laughed. But these stories are so many. What I'm very curious about, though, is in your many years of working in this field, coming across not only people like me, but the victims of human rights injustices, what are the long-term impacts on how human rights politics and state behavior impacts this? You've talked about the justice cascade, for instance, within transnational justice. Could you talk to some of those issues that come up?
So thanks for that question. The issue of impact of transitional justice has been one of the main questions of my life, right? But the dilemma is there's many forms of impact. And so when you talk to victims, you do see that many of them are very disappointed. Even victims in Argentina, which has had more prosecutions than and more transitional justice than virtually any other country in the world, are very disappointed. In some cases, the families of the disappeared are disappointed because they never found the bodies of their loved ones. Of course, many of bodies were dumped from alive from helicopters into Rio de la Plata. So you have first the victim perspective, and just let me say, I've worked for many years by myself, but mainly as parts of research teams, and I want to just underscore this important issue of how my research teams have helped me and helped us explore really diverse topics. Right now, I'm working with a research team that includes two researchers at Harvard University, Fung Pham and Patrick Vink. We call it the group TJET, which is the Transitional Justice Evaluation Team, but we like the title TJET. We have a website, and I want to make sure that your listeners get the chance of, if they want to know more, they can go to this website. It's transitionaljusticedata.org, right? So it's all one word, transitionaljusticedata.org. And there we have put all of the data we've collected. It's all open to the public, it's free of charge, and we really encourage people to go and take a look. But also, if they find any errors, there's also ways you can give your feedback to us and help us correct any missing data we have or any errors we've made. So at that data set, that data was designed exactly to try to answer the question you just asked, and that's the question about impact. So it includes survey data because, as I said, I have these colleagues, Fung Pham and Patrick Vink, and they are among the world's leading experts about doing surveys with victims in conflict zones. They've just come back from doing surveys with 10,000 people in Ethiopia, for example. What they find is that people all over the world demand justice. And so they found a lot of interest in the people they surveyed of having prosecutions, truth commissions, reparations policies in Ethiopia. It's not clear at all if the Ethiopian government is going to be going to be able to supply that justice, but the demand is there. And the second thing we do with our data is we try to answer these questions about impact, but I try to answer them as a political scientist, standing back and looking at data from the whole world. Okay, it's a very different notion of impact than the notion that the victims have. Okay, I can't always answer the victim's question on impact. That's a very personal question for them that it's hard to answer. But I feel like I have something to be able to say because we have looked at and analyzed countries in the world that have had transitional justice, that after transitions to democracy or transitions from civil war, and we compare those to countries that don't have any justice. And what we find is that countries that do have justice see less violence in the future. It's less likely that there will be human rights violations, mass human rights violations, again, in countries that have really implemented transitional justice. And it's less likely there'll be a recurrence of war. So transitional justice, I have some faith in, and how can I say, I have some evidence. That's my evidence for hope, right? My evidence is really evidence that comes from comparative statistical analysis comparing countries with transitional justice to similar countries that with authoritarian past, with human rights violations, but that chose not to have transitional justice.
Yes, well, there's something very important. I guess I would call it part of the social contract that when there is a wrong done, that there is a quid pro quo for that wrong, that we can have some kind of recognition, first, that a wrong was done. Second, what can be done to address this wrong? Mm-hmm. And this is, in fact, what explains our court systems. As I mentioned before we went on air, I suffered something quite incredible with my children during lockdown. And I have had to approach the courts here in Italy to get justice. And I have, in fact, made friends out of some lawyers because of what I've been through. And one of them said to me, Julian, your country is light years ahead of Italy. And I said, but what does that really mean? He says, well, here, in order to have any kind of justice for what you've been through, you would have to practically be dead. I don't think he's wrong on this. And I kept thinking about this because I'm pressing ahead. I'm seeking justice. I'm very tenacious, not stubborn. There's a difference. And I will not stop. And I kept thinking to people like Hector in Argentina, and how when he found out he was a child of a disappeared, his whole life fell apart. He changed his name back to his birth name. He found out the parents who had raised him were the killers of his actual parents. Horrific. He broke up with his girlfriend because he could no longer see himself in his old life. And I kept thinking about him. I kept thinking about the families in the West Bank, in Hebron, in Jerusalem, with whom I had worked. I kept thinking of all these people I've done human rights work with. And I thought, if I can work on the human rights of others, why is it so hard to work on my own? And I understand why there are groups of lawyers and human rights activists that come in, because it's like that saying goes, only a fool represents himself as his lawyer. It's very hard to step outside yourself to seek justice, because it's very emotional too, what you are going through when you are trying to seek justice. So my friend who's the lawyer said, why do you think the mafia rose up here? And I can see that. Mm-hmm. I can see that very clearly, because the injustices that we were subjected to would have landed this individual easily in prison in the States. But in countries like Italy, it's and so these gray spaces become the places where resentment builds, tribal fractions can happen, and that can, of course, escalate into something more. Mm-hmm. So what evidence have you seen, for instance, my love affair was studying the Gacaca courts, but what evidence have you seen that the Gacaca courts, or something similar, perhaps if you have not worked on that, have worked? Could you give us some examples of where transitional justice works and why?
Mm-hmm. So the Gacaca courts and the whole Rwanda case, as well as the International Tribunal on the former Yugoslavia and on the International Tribunal on Rwanda, are all part of our database. So even though I have not personally done research in Rwanda, we do have collect data on that. So the first thing is, part of what you're talking about is there some independent judicial system, right? And there are many countries in the world where there's not an independent judicial system, many authoritarian countries. And we are seeing in the United States right now, I would say, both the importance of an independent judicial system. We've seen the judicial system pushing back against attempts by the Trump administration to violate rights of citizens, okay? But we've also seen big problems with the US judicial system, and that is that the Attorney General, who's the head of all the prosecutors in the country, is a political appointee. And our judicial system, ultimately at the very top level in terms of who's the boss, the Attorney General, is very politicized. And that politicization has been revealed in this time in the United States. So we see both the strengths of the independent judiciary as these judges are pushing back, and we've seen the weaknesses of it as the Attorney General's office is basically trying to shut down demands for justice. You are very correct that everyone is dealing with different national systems, all of which have problems, many of which have problems. And this goes back to the issue again of struggle. Almost everyone who's managed to get a conviction in one of these human rights prosecutions have spent years, if not decades, working on it. You're familiar with the Argentine case, so I don't need to remind you that there was an amnesty law that went into effect shortly after the trials of the juntas that stayed into effect until 2005. So essentially, during this entire, almost 20-year period, it was impossible to get justice. And so the trials then reopened in 2005 and are still moving ahead in Argentina today. So people have faced incredible blockages in their demands for justice. And the amazing thing is that they have persevered in many cases, and in some cases, including even in Guatemala, victories have occurred. As you know, Guatemala was the first country ever to find its former president, in this case, Rios Montt, guilty of genocide. And then after that, that finding was reversed on a technicality higher up. Then there was an effort to reopen that trial, and he was to prosecute again before he died. So justice is very, very difficult, and the fact that we have as much justice as we now are documenting in our database is a testament to the persistence and the creativity and innovation of victim groups, the lawyers, the NGOs they work with.
Are there cases where human rights abuses are so grave that it becomes almost impossible to find people from that area, from that country, who would be objective enough to hear these cases wherein outside judges, outside jurists must be brought in?
You may remember in the case of Guatemala, in fact, there was a UN, how can I say, there was a joint UN Guatemalan justice system program set up called CICIG. And it was sometimes for human rights and sometimes for corruption, and turned out to be a very, very important and effective system of prosecuting corruption because they had some international involvement that was able to overcome domestic blockage. But during the first Trump administration, that program was shut down. Okay. No one was there. It offended a lot of the elites in Guatemala who'd been accused of corruption, and without any support from the United States, they were able to shut it down. So the CICIG is one example of one of these kind of hybrid institutions that turned out to be very effective, that then for political reasons was shut down.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Well, that's interesting because it's often, obviously, in our country as well, the educated class that has the scholarship, the training to go after these cases. But as in the case of Guatemala and other situations, it's often the elite, not all, who are the ones who are often guilty of the crimes being charged, which presents a whole set of other problems, of course. At the same time, I'm wondering how we could better balance individual rights with collective responsibilities in democratic societies, given the examples you've given from not just Minnesota, but all over our country. We're seeing all sorts of problems that many people want to say it's Trump, but please, Obama, Clinton, really. A lot of the work I was doing with the disappeared men in Brooklyn were victims of laws that came from Clinton era. So I'm wondering how this could be made more transparent, or would it turn into something like a C-SPAN channel where we'd have 24/7? It would be like Night Court, but we'd have 24/7. That could be an interesting comedy series, Human Rights Night Court, because there are so many abuses within our country. What's happening with immigrants, not just now under Trump, but what's been happening with immigrants. the many abuses in human trafficking. Human trafficking is one of the situations that we're hearing now because of Jeffrey Epstein, but human trafficking has been going on since time immemorial. It was called many other things before, but people should really, I hate to say this, but read a bit. It's depressing. When I was in Haiti, I had a meeting at the MINUSTA one day, and that changed my being forever. I wish I hadn't heard and saw what I heard and saw. And I looked at my colleague who was from the UN, and we just sat together for an hour and we could not talk after what we heard. We had heard things that if you think sex trafficking is the worst thing that happens to children, you're way off, way off. And I think that when we're looking at the plethora of human rights abuses, Kathryn, what can be done when, on the one hand, the state will want to protect its own? So, of course, none of the incriminating evidence against Trump is in the Epstein files. On the other hand, we have enough know-how in how to approach some of these problems and how to handle them, but it's not being instrumentalized. What do you suggest in terms of making some steps? I mean, it's easy to tell Rwandans what to do, but maybe we should be cleaning up our own backyard.
So the first thing is that most of the trials, truth commissions, reparations policies we are studying it's called transitional justice for a reason. These are countries that have gone through a transition from authoritarianism to democracy or from war to peace. Okay. And so the first thing is this is not happening in fully authoritarian countries. And it's not happening mainly in countries in the midst of civil wars. It's happening because of transitions. So the first thing that has to happen is if you live in an authoritarian country, there needs to be pressure to have a transition so that you can have a functioning judicial system again. As you know, during these authoritarian governments, the judicial system just basically shuts down as an independent arm of government. And so that's why people have to work to protect their democracy too. And may I say, in the case of the United States right now, our democracy is under threat. Some commentators want to say we are no longer democracy. I don't accept that in the sense that I think that the Trump administration is governing in an authoritarian manner. There's no doubt that they're governing in an authoritarian manner. But our country still has democratic institutions that are places where people can push back. I've mentioned earlier the judicial system. There's a lot of pushback from especially lower level judges who are pushing back and demanding rights. But it's also necessary for people to push back. And may I say the most important thing right now coming up is what's going to happen in the midterm elections. Okay. And so what I want to say here, a lot of people are very worried about what's happening, but they may not be registered to vote. Okay, or prepared to vote in the midterm elections. The midterm elections are extremely important. The entire House of Representatives will be elected, a third of the Senate. And so you talked about responsibilities. We have rights and we have responsibilities. We have the right to vote. We also have the responsibility to vote. You may know that in the last election, the one that brought President Trump to power, many people decided to stay home and not go to vote. Okay. They had multiple reasons for that. Some were worried about Gaza and were opposed to the Biden administration Gaza policy, etc. But many people didn't vote. And so the most important thing people can do today in the United States, if they're concerned about the need for justice and if they're concerned about the problems of authoritarianism, is to exercise their right and their responsibility to vote. And I've been working with organizations that help give information to U.S. citizens abroad about voting. And one problem is many U.S. citizens abroad, we don't even know how many U.S. citizens live abroad, anything where between 3.5 million and 5.5 million probably. But the estimates are that only something between 3.5 and 10% of U.S. citizens abroad vote. Okay. So one thing I would like to say to your listeners is if you're a U.S. citizen abroad and if you're worried about the United States, you need to exercise your right to vote. And the United States has quite a on paper and so far in practice, we have a system that permits people abroad, citizens abroad, are permitted to vote in federal elections. There's national legislation that guarantees your right to vote. There are excellent websites. And again, I want to mention specifically here the U.S. Vote Foundation and the Oversee Vote. Just type in Oversee Vote, okay, and you will get a terrific website that'll give you step by step everything you need to vote. So, American citizens abroad, if you're concerned about voting, if you're concerned about what's happening in the United States, the first and most important thing that you personally can do, and you can and urge your friends to do, is to go to these websites, and especially the Vote Oversee and the U.S. Vote Foundation, that will give you a step-by-step guide for submitting your request to register and get an absentee ballot.
I actually just received an email yesterday from the Center for U.S. Voters Abroad. I registered with them to re-register because I don't know if this is normal, but I had to re-register. I registered for the last election, the presidential election, and now again. So I did it, and you can now vote online as well. So it's much easier than having to send the ballots in to the local embassy.
It varies by state, and that's the issue. And so it depends on what where your last residence is. Many people think they have to maintain a residence in the United States in order to vote. That's not true. You have to give your last residence. It can be one you haven't lived in for years. It can be one that doesn't even, your house was torn down.
Yes,
you have to give your last, no, seriously, you have to
That's
give
true.
your last residence.
Yep.
And if you do that, it's important. The reason you do that is because these federal elections involve people for the House of Representatives and for the Senate. Well, then we have to know what state you're going to vote in. Your ballot will vary in terms of what state you're going to vote in. And so it's crucial that you have to give your last residence, and then you get a ballot that will allow you to vote in that state, including for the specific House of Representative district where your last resident was located. But not that voting online will vary by state because the states control. You still have to mail it. And the important thing, again, for your listeners to know, many people think they can fill the ballot out and give it to someone to put in a mailbox in the US, and that is wrong. You will invalidate your international ballot if you do that. Your ballot must be postmarked from abroad.
Good point. Yes, I guess some people might do that if they have relatives visiting, thinking it won't get lost.
Exactly. So that's the best way. I mean, once you go through all that work, if you haven't understood that, they will send your ballot to you, and you then have to mail that ballot in from an your international location.
How do transnational advocacy networks adapt their strategies to target non-democratic states?
So one of the things that's happened a lot in recent years is, if you remember, kind of in the terrible days of the 70s, the state, like, let's talk about Guatemala. When the genocide was happening in Guatemala, actually in 1980, under Rios Montt, the Rios Montt government had just wiped out all the opposition. There were basically no functioning human rights groups in Guatemala because they'd all been destroyed by repression. Okay. Nowadays, states are sometimes doing that, but more often they have a whole plethora of new and even more complicated strategies. They're making human rights groups register as foreign agents, which is ways of targeting them for repression. They're publicizing, they're making them publicize all the places they get money from. So it makes it look like they're operating as foreign agents. And so these groups are facing real challenges about how to operate. However, those groups have always faced challenges. Sometimes in the old days, the government just killed you. Nowadays, they're making you register as a foreign agent. That's bad, but it's something you can overcome. And one thing local human rights groups are recognizing is that they have to find domestic support for their organizations. And while foreign funding has always been important, it's important to get domestic funding for your human rights work. So when the government tries to basically threaten you by denouncing you as a foreign agent, you can show that you have a domestic base. And that's happened in places like, Hungary and Argentina and other places. These groups are starting to really do what NGOs have always had to do, and that is, try to get supporters, local supporters who pay part of the way.
Well, I'm thinking about in terms of these organizations and how do they interact within the justice mechanism itself. And I might even add to that the ways in which NGOs are included, because you don't just have Save the Children or NGOs that are invested in housing and feeding people. There are NGOs specifically like Red R. I had a lot of work to do with them in Haiti, and many others like them, Tier Fund, that work on human rights abuses specifically. So the line between government and NGO sometimes is blurred. How do transnational advocacy networks work when it comes to these kinds of organizations that bleed over national boundaries or that might be involved, even in a negative sense, with certain governmental mandates?
So when you read the NGO literature today, you'll find there's lots of new acronyms. There's NGOs, but there's something called GONGOs. And GONGOs are government organized NGOs, basically. So governments realized that these NGOs were, how can I say, were becoming more powerful. And they said, we need some of our own NGOs. And they started organizing NGOs. So these are the GONGOs. You have DONGOs, which are donor organized NGOs. And that's a problem too. It can be a well-intentioned donor, but if it really sees like all the impetus is coming from the donor and not from real people on the place, that's a problem. So the first thing I think people need to do is, just because someone says they're an NGO doesn't mean you think, oh, they're a good guy. You have to do your research on where are the NGOs that have a history of doing genuine human rights work and having a certain amount of having autonomy from the government, and generally really non-governmental, and not being creatures simply of donors either. And that's been one big problem in Haiti, in fact, is that the donors have kind of become too pervasive. There's of course, a wide variety of donors, including a lot of evangelical churches and others. And so not every NGO is going to be a reliable or principled actor. And you want to, before you get involved and before you support ones, you need to know more. It's not easy to find, it's not difficult to find that out. People kind of know who are the GONGOs and who are the DONGOs and who are the genuine NGOs and social movements, but you have to do some research.
You mentioned earlier about the ways in which the prosecution of human rights abuses can in fact mitigate future conflicts and wars. Does the prosecution of state leaders also follow this path in deterring future human rights abuses?
Yes. So we have a paper on the website I mentioned to you earlier. And so again, people want to go to the website, transitionaljusticedata.org. You'll see something called analysis. We have short papers as well as some of our longer publications linked there that you can read. But one of them has to do about heads of state, prosecutions of heads of state. We've long known that human rights prosecutions are associated with improvements in human rights. We have found that if those prosecutions include high-level people, you get a bigger impact. Okay, so it doesn't mean you have to only prosecute high-level people or heads of state. Okay, but if prosecutions of heads of state and higher level people makes a bigger difference for human rights, democracy.
That makes me feel better, even though I don't actively work in that field. Adjacently, however, what is the role of reputation in holding governments accountable to international norms?
So the issue of reputation, you maybe know international relations, it's a big issue. Another way to think about reputation is trustworthiness, right? Other people have talked about in terms of soft power. Joe Nye has talked about in terms of soft power. These are all related concepts, right? And that is, it's not only power, sort of raw power that matters. It's also your reputation. It's also your soft power, the power of the attraction of your ideas and your culture. It's also trustworthiness. So people trust you to keep your word, right? And so, what we're seeing right now is that the Trump administration is engaged in many exercises of hard power. Some people have called it, this is Henry Farrell has referred to this as weaponized interdependence. Virtually all of the interactions of the Trump administration with the world have been exercises of weaponized interdependence. It's using all the hard power that they have at their able to threaten other countries to get them to do what they want. Okay. In the short term, this appears to work. Many countries are afraid of Trump. Many countries have brokered deals that are not what they want because they're afraid of Trump, okay, and the Trump administration. In the long term, I'm going to argue here that this is a losing strategy. Okay. In the long term, a lot of international relations is greased by trust and by reputation. And if you get a reputation for only weaponizing your relations with the world, that is not going to help you in the long term. I have a former graduate student who's now teaching at Cornell University, Averill Schmidt. He did his dissertation on saying, what happens to countries that withdraw from treaties? And it turns out that if you withdraw from treaties, the other members of the treaty from which you withdrew will no longer sign new agreements with you because they don't trust you anymore. Okay. So trust and reputation are kind of amorphous things, but they matter in international relations. And we're starting to see some of that right now. There's this pushback, of course, from the Europeans who are saying, that the rule-based order is over and they need to go their own way, right? This is Mark Carney's speech in Davos, for example. And so that's the kind of thing that happens. Even your closest allies, like Canada, stop trusting you and stop wanting to working with you.
Although Carney said what people have been saying for years. And one must wonder why the middle power, let's say, of Canada and its leader would make such an utterance. Yet we saw his words after Machado was kidnapped. Mm-hmm. So it's like a lot of these leaders are conveniently speaking out of both sides of their mouths. I could add on to that Macron. I could add on to that, oh my God, Sir Keir, on and on. There's too much to say about what's happening in the European Union. And daily, I post videos of a guest from the show earlier who is an expert in the field of Ukraine, Russia, of these kidnapping of young men from the streets. Not always young, by the way. They're kidnapping these men to inscribe them into the army. And we're witnessing, like I said earlier, human rights abuses galore now. Mm-hmm. And it's a very dangerous moment in our history because, well, I was growing up, you said 1976, that was the year my family moved to the United States from Canada. I was a young kid. And so I grew up learning about the world. At 10, your consciousness is opening up. I remember watching Roots. I remember seeing horribly racist graffiti in New Orleans and wondering, what does that word mean? Yet there was, not so many years later, you mentioned Guatemala, the disappearance of entire villages. I mean, this is insane. And not just disappearance, the mowing down. So I have to wonder what the place of human rights is today, because, how do you measure the impact of a norm that prevents a violation from happening in the first place, for instance? Yeah. You spoke of reputation, but how can we have hope? You are very hopeful compared to many people. How can many people have this kind of hope where they see that international law doesn't matter in their case, or doesn't matter for the case of their family back home who's still seeking justice?
Yeah. So I have long spoken out against human rights violations wherever they occur. Okay. And I've long spoken out against complicity of the United States government with human rights violations. Okay, and this goes back, I mean, if you read what I've written, it goes back to criticizing the Dulles brothers for the 1954 intervention in Guatemala that set that country on the course that later led to genocide. Okay, so back in the early days, criticized Reagan administration policy, spoke out against the Bush administration illegal invasion of Iraq, and in particular, as you know, I have a whole chapter in my book, The Justice Cascade, that says, is the United States immune to the Justice Cascade? Because no one was ever held accountable for U.S. use of torture in Abu Ghraib prison and during the Iraq War. Okay. Now,
And the many black sites as
yeah,
well,
and the
right?
many black sites. Okay. So having said all that, okay, I think it's important not to sort of say it's all the same. There's never any difference. Okay. I was in Washington, D.C., working with the Human Rights Organization during the Carter administration. And I can tell you that it made a big difference to people in Latin America that finally the US president was talking about human rights. And when Patricia Darien, who was Carter's deputy secretary, the first ever deputy secretary of state for human rights, went to Argentina and met with the mothers of the disappeared. And during the military government, it made a huge difference. So it makes a big difference who's in power, what they believe, and what they do. And I just want to say, right now in the United States, um, I think Carney and the Europeans are very right to speak out. We're talking about a whole different level of untrustworthiness. We're talking about a whole different level of weaponized interdependence that, while it has appeared in the past, they are taking it to new highs. So I don't think we should blur what's happening right now in the US as if this has always been the case.
I'm thinking of when he spoke of the kind of new normal. I think the case has been, I mean, look at the rise of BRICS. We're seeing country after country move away from the hegemon. And this preceded Trump. And when I say it preceded Trump, I mean Trump won, not just the second administration. Because obviously, well, comparatively, his first administration was the first administration in my lifetime where a U.S. president did not break out into war. He's made up for it in recent months, of course, but I'm speaking of the first administration uniquely. I do dislike intensely, and it's nothing against Carney, but it's a general problem in Europe where leaders will, in fact, somewhat critique. Well, Maduro wasn't really elected. I'm like, what? He was just kidnapped. We just saw it. And the kind of gaslighting, I guess what the feminists would call, that's going on. So, yes, it is true what he said, but don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. And I worry that that's happening because here in the EU, ever since the internet law went into action back in 2021, I presume is when it started up and became more in vigor the next year, we're facing criminalization for things that would not be the case in the States. And I know things are off the rails there, especially criticizing anything to do with Israel, anything to do with, and now criticizing ICE. And it will get worse, but at least we still so far have the First Amendment. The UK has fared better not having the First Amendment in the fights related to the woman confronting gender ideology, for instance. That's gone very well. The Tavistock Clinic was shut down. These horrible experiments using children's bodies has been stopped. The sterilization of children, let's be clear. So that's good. And there was a threat to the freedom to speak about it because I have had on the show people who've had the constabulary at their door, knock, knock, knock. Did you write this on Twitter? You need to come down, give an interview. In fact, one person has been interviewed by the police many times over things she said. There's a balance of individual rights with collective in terms of the kind of cases you work on. And to a less extreme degree, the freedom of speech is always in the balance. The way in which the International Holocaust Remembrance Association has sealed on wax this new meaning of anti-Semitism, which has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It has to do with criticizing state action of Israel. Yeah. So we're seeing that adopted in many universities in the States, in Canada.
At Harvard, we're actually using the Holocaust Remembrance definition. And so I have thought about it in terms of use in my classes. And the definition is actually a little more complex than you suggest, very complicated, but complex. And that is, it says, one, speaking against Israel and Israel politics is not in and of itself anti-Semitism. And then it goes on to say, however, only speaking of Israel and its politics, only criticizing Israel and its politics can be anti-Semitism. Okay, so that's the line we're working at. So for example, when I teach in my international law class, I teach, and I have taught I started teaching it from the time the South Africa v. Israel case first came down. I've been teaching that in my international law class because why? I teach the International Court of Justice. I teach the International Criminal Court. How am I not going to teach what those courts are doing vis-a-vis Israel? I also teach the Gambia v. Myanmar case, right, on genocide. I also teach the earlier cases already decided by the ICJ on the former Yugoslavia, where they did find genocide, but only in the case of Srebrenica, okay? Because I need my students to understand all of those cases. So it's not, how can I say, when I'm teaching the ICJ, I always teach the South Africa Israel case. I teach the other cases too. I don't think anyone's going to accuse me of anti-Semitism, even using the Holocaust remembrance definition.
That definition, we've talked about it on the show with other guests who specialized, in fact, on some of this, who've been no-platformed out of their profession because of this. And I find it fascinating that it was just 6 weeks ago, I believe, that Netanyahu made a reference. He broke the rule, basically. He made a reference to Hamas and Palestine and the Holocaust in one sentence. And I'm like, oh, he broke the ILHRA rule. So it was really funny to me because it cuts both ways. How has international law influenced domestic prosecutions of human rights violations over the past 30 years?
So first, international law influenced domestic prosecutions because various treaties were, many countries, when they ratified a treaty, then institutionalized that treaty into their domestic criminal law system. Okay, so if you ratify the Convention Against Torture, then you make sure you have domestic legislation that criminalizes torture. Any country that ratified the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court had to change their criminal law in many ways in order to have crimes like genocide and crime against humanity be prosecutable in domestic courts as well as in the ICC. So there are many direct ways in which international law has been incorporated into domestic law, and then that domestic law has been used to prosecute human rights violations. Okay. Now, there's others really interesting ways that different countries have worked creatively with this. For example, again, you know the case of Argentina, so let me just give an example. When the original trials of the juntas were on kidnapping, there was no law about disappearance, right? It didn't exist in the criminal code, so they prosecuted on kidnapping. Kidnapping had a statute of limitations, and so they could no longer prosecute kidnapping. But then with international treaty Argentina had ratified, which was a treaty that said there were no statutes of limitations for crimes against humanity. And so now they're prosecuting disappearances, and they get rid of statute of limitations by this international treaty that says you can't have statute of limitations for crimes against humanity. Okay, so there's a very interesting and creative interaction between international law and domestic law that play out in these domestic prosecutions. Thank you.